Power built on fear is always fragile, and J-Rock ruled his streets by making sure no one dared to challenge him. So when his crew set their sights on Vanessa Williams, a frail black woman with cancer, moving slowly through her neighborhood, they saw nothing but weakness. They laughed, shoved her, took what they wanted, and walked away, believing the story ended there. They had no idea that Vanessa's husband, Mark Williams, was a former Marine with a lifetime of combat experience and an unshakable code. He had walked away from violence once, but when he found his wife bruised and broken, there was no turning back. Now, as J-Rock's empire begins to crack from the inside, Mark is closing in, not with reckless fury, but with the precision of a man who never lost a war. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. Vanessa Williams took slow, measured steps along the cracked sidewalk, pulling her coat tighter against the crisp afternoon air. The late autumn sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, spilling through thinning tree branches, dappling the pavement with fleeting patterns of light and shadow. It should have been comforting, but she barely felt its warmth. The world had changed since her diagnosis. Sounds seemed distant, the air always a little heavier. Even the scent of the city, a mix of car exhaust, rain-damp earth, and simmering spices from corner kitchens, felt different now, less familiar, as if she were moving through a version of reality she no longer belonged to. But today, for a brief moment, she felt almost normal. The scent of fried chicken and collard greens drifted from Miss Laverne's soul food restaurant, tugging at memories buried beneath the weight of the last few months. Long Sunday dinners with Mark, the clatter of plates, the rich laughter that once filled their home. Those days had felt endless, effortless, as if time itself had bent to their happiness. Now, every day was a fight, not just against the disease, but against the way people looked at her, as if she were fragile, as if she had already begun to disappear. A child's laughter rang out from a nearby yard, bright and untamed, a sound so alive that it cut through the fog in her mind. Vanessa smiled faintly, adjusting her scarf as a gust of wind tugged at its ends. Then she heard it. A whistle. Sharp. Purposeful. "Yo, check it," a voice muttered, her body tensed, her fingers curling into the wool of her coat. Instinctively, she glanced up and saw them. 6 men near the alleyway, lounging against the brick wall like they owned the street, their postures loose, but their eyes sharp. "Damn," one of them chuckled. "She's sick or something?" The words hit like a slap, cutting through her fragile moment of peace. Vanessa lowered her gaze, quickened her pace. "Keep walking." "Where you going in a hurry, Auntie?" "Keep walking. Don't look back." Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, pounding like a drum against the inside of her skull. "Keep walking. Don't look back." Just a few more steps, and she'd be past them, beyond whatever this was. She focused on the cracked pavement beneath her shoes, willing her legs to move faster, but then footsteps. A slow shuffle at first, then quicker, more purposeful. They moved in, closing the space around her before she could react. Her breath hitched. A presence loomed just behind her. Too close. "Relax," a voice murmured, smooth and unbothered. Before she could turn, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Firm. Possessive. Vanessa flinched, her body rigid with instinctive fear. She turned, meeting a wide, lazy grin that sent a cold wave down her spine. J-Rock. His confidence oozed through the smirk curling at his lips, the kind of arrogance that came with knowing he had nothing to lose and everything to take. "Ain't no need to be rude," he drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "We just want to talk." Behind him, a few of the younger ones shifted, their bravado flickering at the edges. Vanessa forced herself to stand straight, to keep her voice steady. "I don't have anything for you," J-Rock chuckled, low and dismissive. "Now that's just not true." A hand darted toward her purse. Reflex took over. She yanked it back, clutching it to her side. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather, knuckles whitening. "Come on, man," one of the younger gang members muttered under his breath. His voice wavered, almost reluctant. She ain't even got hair, man." The words hung in the air like an exposed nerve. Vanessa saw it then. Hesitation. Uncertainty. The boy looked at her, really looked, then flicked his gaze toward J-Rock. J-Rock's easy smirk faltered. His eyes darkened, sharpening like the edge of a blade. "She ain't got hair. So what?" he snapped, turning his full attention to the younger one. His voice, once playful, now carried an edge of challenge. "That means she ain't got money?" He took a step closer, shoulders squared. "You soft now?" Silence thickened between them, stretching unbearably. The younger one dropped his gaze, lips pressing into a thin, uneasy line. Vanessa's fingers trembled where they clutched the strap of her bag. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, but the chill running through her had nothing to do with the weather. She swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. For a second, no one moved. Then J-Rock shoved her. Hard. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming into the rough brick wall. Pain flared up her side, sharp and immediate, knocking the breath from her lungs. She barely had time to recover before another hand yanked at her purse, the force jerking her forward. She clung to the strap, her fingers burning as it was ripped from her grasp. The sting shot through her palm, and she gasped, clutching her wrist, as if that could somehow stop the tremors in her hands. One of the younger ones, the hesitant one, shifted uneasily. His sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he took a small step back. "Yo, we don't need to!" J-Rock's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. His voice was sharp, cutting through the moment like a blade. "You got something to say?" A pause, heavy with tension. The younger one's lips parted, but he hesitated too long. "Nah," he mumbled, eyes dropping to the ground. Vanessa barely had time to brace herself before another shove sent her sprawling. This time, there was no wall to catch her. The pavement was unforgiving. Cold, hard, unyielding. Her knees scraped against the rough concrete, and she landed on her side, the shock of the impact leaving her momentarily dazed. The chill of the ground seeped into her skin, its unforgiving surface pressing against her cheek. J-Rock crouched beside her, his presence looming, his breath warm against the cold air. There was something in his eyes, something sharp and cruel, a flicker of satisfaction as he reached forward. She flinched, expecting another blow, but instead, his fingers curled around the edge of her scarf. Without hesitation, he yanked it away. The cold air hit her bare scalp. Silence. A shift in energy. One of them moved, barely perceptible. Discomfort creeping into his stance. "She got cancer, man," someone muttered, the words hanging in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. "So?" J-Rock scoffed, his voice laced with amusement and something meaner underneath. "Y'all feel bad now? Man, y'all weak as hell." His sneer deepened as he straightened up, brushing off his jeans like this whole thing was just another routine. "She still got money, don't she?" No one answered. Vanessa lay curled in on herself, gripping her ribs as sharp, ragged breaths escaped her lips. Every inhale sent a fresh wave of pain rippling through her chest. She couldn't fight back, couldn't even move without agony flaring through her body. All she could do was stay there, pressed against the unforgiving pavement, waiting for it to be over. Somewhere above her, footsteps shuffled, the sound of sneakers scuffing against concrete. Some of them were leaving. Some, but not all. And then J-Rock's voice cut through the moment like a blade, cold and final. "Nah, we ain't done." Vanessa's stomach twisted. She forced herself onto her hands and knees, desperate to push herself up, to get away, to do something. But before she could rise, pain exploded in her side. A boot crashed into her ribs, knocking the breath clean out of her lungs. A sharp, agonizing crack tore through her, splintering her senses. She barely registered the pavement slamming against her back as she crumpled, choking on a strangled cry of pain. "Damn," someone muttered, their voice edged with uncertainty. "Yo, Jay, we got what we came for, man." "Shut the hell up," J-Rock snapped. His tone was different this time, sharper, laced with irritation. He crouched down beside her again, his shadow stretching over her, swallowing what little light was left. He was enjoying this, dragging it out, making sure she knew he had the power here. Vanessa clenched her jaw, her hands curling into fists as she fought back the burn behind her eyes. Don't cry. Don't give him that. She wouldn't let him see her break. Slowly, she turned her head, forcing herself to look at them, to see their faces. Some of them wouldn't meet her eyes. Some looked away, shifting uncomfortably, their postures rigid with unease. The one who had spoken earlier, the hesitant one, stood stiffly with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Leon. She thought she had heard one of them call him that. His jaw was tight, his gaze flickering between her and J-Rock. There was something in his expression, a hesitation, a quiet battle behind his eyes, like he wanted to speak, but knew better, like he wanted to stop this, but didn't know how. She latched onto that hesitation, grasping it like a lifeline. Doubt lingered in some of them. It was subtle, a quiet discomfort shifting beneath their bravado, but it was there. Not all of them wanted this. Not all of them were like him. J-Rock, however, had no hesitation, no second thoughts, no flicker of remorse. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the power, who reveled in it. His fingers twisted into the fabric of her coat, tightening around the collar as he yanked her upward, just enough to force her to face him. His grip was like iron, digging into the worn material, pressing against her skin. His breath hit her face, warm and sour, thick with the sharp bite of cheap liquor and stale cigarettes. "Look at you," he sneered, his voice laced with cruel amusement. "All weak. You ever think about just giving up?" Vanessa didn't answer. She wouldn't give him that. His fingers flexed against her collar, pulling her just a little closer. "I asked you a question." His voice was low now, dangerous, daring her to defy him. Pain rippled through her body, but she refused to look away. Her jaw clenched, her breathing shallow and uneven. Slowly she met his gaze, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "And I'm not answering." For a second, just a second, his expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe surprise. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. His hand moved fast, too fast for her to react. The back of his palm struck her across the face with brutal force, snapping her head to the side. A burst of white-hot pain exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted, blurred at the edges, and before she could catch herself, she was falling again. The pavement was unforgiving, the impact rattling through her bones. "Man, come on," Leon muttered, his voice barely above a breath. "She already down." J-Rock's head snapped toward him, his glare sharp enough to cut. "The hell you sayin'?" Leon's shoulders tensed. For a second, he looked like he might back down. But then he squared his jaw, forcing himself to speak. "I just mean, she ain't fighting back. We did what we came to do." His voice wavered, uncertainty flickering beneath the surface, but the words were out now, standing between them like a challenge. J-Rock studied him, his expression darkening, unreadable. The air grew thick with something unspoken. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "Aight," he said, pushing himself up, brushing off his hands like this had been nothing more than a chore. "We done." Vanessa didn't move, didn't breathe. She stayed perfectly still, listening, waiting. Footsteps shuffled away, some quick, eager to leave. One pair hesitated, then followed. She didn't look up until the last of them had disappeared. Silence, the kind that felt too big, stretching out endlessly around her. For a long moment, she simply lay there, staring up at the empty sky. The deep, dark blue stretched overhead, distant and indifferent, as if none of this had happened, as if she were nothing more than another piece of the cold pavement beneath her. Her ribs ached with every breath. Her face throbbed where J-Rock's hand had struck. But the worst pain wasn't in her body. It was deeper, settling somewhere inside her, twisting like a knife. This place, her home, no longer felt safe. The streets she had walked for years, the sidewalks worn with familiarity, now felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. The air was thick, pressing in around her, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. She sucked in a shaky breath, her chest tightening as pain lanced through her ribs. The sting in her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not now. Slowly, carefully, she rolled onto her side, her body protesting every movement. Fire shot through her ribs with each inch she gained, but she gritted her teeth, jaw locked against the pain. There was no other choice. Giving in wasn't an option. Inch by inch, she forced herself onto her knees, steadying her weight against her palms. The rough pavement dug into her skin, but she barely noticed. Her gaze landed on her scarf, lying a few feet away, trampled and dirty. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of something hollow through her chest. With trembling fingers, she reached for it, her hands unsteady as she brushed off the dirt. The fabric felt rougher now, weaker, like something that had been stepped on one too many times. Still, she wrapped it back around her head, the motion careful, deliberate. It felt like trying to hold together something that was already broken. Vanessa staggered as she pushed herself upright, her balance unsteady. She needed to get home. That was the only thought that mattered. Home. She didn't notice the blood at the corner of her mouth, the dark smear against her skin. She didn't notice the way her body hunched forward protectively, as if bracing for another blow. She didn't even notice the quiet set of eyes watching from a nearby doorway. Lingering, hesitant, she just walked, step by step, home. The moment Mark Williams pulled into the driveway, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, no broken windows, no signs of a struggle, but it was in the stillness, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath. Usually, there was life here. Music playing from the kitchen, the soft hum of the TV drifting from the living room, the subtle sounds of a home lived in. But tonight, there was only silence. His gut tightened. He shut off the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air had turned colder since the morning, crisp with the bite of approaching winter. But the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right. Mark unlocked the front door and stepped inside, his senses on high alert. "Vanessa?" His voice was calm, steady, controlled. No answer. His gaze swept the living room, empty. A half-full glass of water sat on the coffee table, untouched, the condensation gathering in a small ring beneath it. The coat she usually hung neatly by the door was crumpled on the floor, discarded carelessly. That wasn't like her. His pulse ticked up as he moved through the house, his footsteps purposeful but quiet. Then he heard it. Water running. His head turned toward the bathroom, where a thin stream of steam curled from the cracked doorway, bleeding into the dim hallway light. Mark approached quietly, pushing the door open just enough to see her. Vanessa stood at the sink, a damp washcloth pressed against her cheek. Her scarf lay neatly folded on the counter beside her, untouched, but her hands trembled as she dabbed at her skin. The deep purple bruise blooming along her jaw made his breath catch, a slow, burning rage igniting in his chest. Sharp and violent. She didn't flinch when he stepped inside, didn't even look up. His voice, when he spoke, was low, measured, controlled only by force. Who did this? For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just kept scrubbing at a spot on her arm, her fingers moving in slow, desperate circles, as if she could scrub away what had happened, as if she could erase it from her skin, from her mind. But no matter how much pressure she applied, no matter how raw her skin became, the feeling wouldn't leave. The dirt, the fear, it was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. Vanessa. Mark's reflection appeared beside hers in the mirror, his gaze steady, searching. He didn't speak again, didn't push her for an answer, but the way he looked at her, like he could see right through the act, right through the mask she was barely holding together, made her chest tighten. Her lip trembled, just slightly. Then her shoulders sagged, and she finally let go. The words spilled out, shaky at first, then all at once. Everything. The gang. the shoving, the laughter, J-Rock. How some of them had hesitated when they saw she was sick, but how that hadn't stopped them. How nothing had stopped them. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but she forced herself to say it all, to let him hear what had been done to her. By the time she finished, Mark's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His face remained unreadable. His expression calm, controlled, but Vanessa knew him. She could see it. The fury simmering just beneath his skin, coiled like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His breathing was even, measured, but there was tension in every inch of him, in the rigid set of his jaw, in the way his chest rose just a little too sharply with every breath. Then, slowly, he exhaled, forcing his fingers to uncurl, willing his voice to soften. "Come here." She hesitated, only for a second, before stepping into his arms. The moment his arms wrapped around her, she pressed her face into his chest, her body sinking into his warmth, his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. "I got you," he murmured against her hair, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise you, baby. I got you." Vanessa nodded, the movement small, barely there, but she didn't ask him what he meant. Because she already knew. Mark helped her to bed, his movements careful, almost reverent, as he tucked the blanket around her, smoothing the fabric as if afraid she might break. He lingered, his palm resting against the scarf covering her head, his thumb brushing over the edge before he finally pulled away. She was already fading into sleep, exhaustion pulling her under. Then, without a sound, he stepped out of the room and pulled out his phone. First call, Detective Lisa Monroe. She picked up on the third ring, her voice laced with familiarity but also fatigue. "Williams," she greeted. "What's up?" Mark's grip tightened around the phone. "My wife was attacked." His voice was flat, cold. A pause. Then Monroe's breath hitched, the sharp intake barely audible over the line. "What? You serious? Would I be calling if I wasn't?" Another pause, this one heavier. Then the shift, the tone he recognized, the professional one, the one that meant she was already moving, already putting the pieces together in her mind. "Where? When?" Mark gave her the details, every word clipped, precise. The names, the location, what they took. Monroe was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. "Listen," Monroe said carefully, her voice measured, threading caution between her words. "I'll put in the report, and I'll push it through. But I gotta be real with you. J-Rock's got ties. Not just to the streets, but to some people who'd rather not see him locked up. This case might not move fast." Mark's grip on the phone tightened, his fingers flexing around the smooth surface. His jaw locked, the muscle ticking as he forced himself to breathe through the frustration clawing at his chest. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "It'll move fast." Monroe heard it, the edge in his tone, the quiet threat laced between the words. "Mark," she warned, her voice firm, controlled, but edged with something close to concern. "Don't do this. Let me handle it." His response came too quickly, too easily. "I am letting you handle it." A pause. Then, just as evenly, "For now." Monroe cursed under her breath, the frustration bleeding through the line. "Damn it, Williams. I know that tone." The call ended. Mark sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the floor, listening to the quiet hum of the house around him. The air was thick with stillness, the kind that came after something broke. His mind drifted, back to the man he used to be, the man he had spent years burying, a soldier, a weapon, a man who knew how to make things disappear. He had left that life behind, built something different with Vanessa, something steady, something real, a life not defined by violence. But now that life felt like an illusion, if the cops wouldn't move fast, he would. J-Rock and his people thought they ran these streets, thought they could do what they wanted without consequence. They had no idea who they'd just crossed. Mark sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the wooden surface. The dim light overhead cast long, stretching shadows across the room, the glow from the screen reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. Anger was reckless, impulsive. He was past that. He was calculating. Vanessa was asleep in the next room, her breathing soft and even. But Mark wouldn't rest. Not now. Not until he had what he needed. Names, locations, a plan. His mind was already working, dissecting every detail, every possibility, every weak spot in J-Rock's operation. He started with the basics: local gang activity, known associates, prior arrests. J-Rock wasn't just some street thug shaking people down for pocket change. He had a network, a reputation. And reputations weren't invincible. They could be dismantled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but fear and ruin. The police database was off-limits, but Mark didn't need official records. He had his own sources, people who owed him, people who understood the value of information. Without hesitation, he reached for his phone and dialed. The call barely rang before a voice answered on the first ring. Williams. A pause, a slight shift in tone. It's been a while. Too long. Mark muttered, his voice low, clipped. I need intel on a crew out here. J-Rock's people. You got anything on them? The man on the other end exhaled slowly, the sound of hesitation clear even through the phone. That's a dangerous name to be asking about. Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. Silence had a way of making people uncomfortable, of pressing down until they felt the weight of it. Sure enough, the voice on the other end filled the empty space. Runs low-level street stuff. Drugs, weapons, intimidation. Police don't touch him much, either too scared or too paid off. Mark's fingers tapped lightly against the table, his expression unreadable. That all? A sigh came through the line, followed by a pause, like the man on the other end was debating whether to say more. There's a kid in his crew. Leon Harris. Young, not deep in the life yet. Might be the only one with a conscience. That was enough. A crack in the armor. A weak link in the chain. Appreciate it, Mark said, his voice flat, final. He ended the call without another word. Finding a gang member in this city wasn't difficult. They moved in patterns, predictable routines they thought made them invisible, but only made them easier to track. Same streets, same habits, same spots where they felt untouchable. You just had to watch long enough. Mark parked down the street from a rundown liquor store, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, scanning the sidewalk with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Leon was there, just like he expected. Shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, standing just outside the weak glow of a flickering streetlight. He wasn't posturing like the others, wasn't laughing, wasn't trying to prove anything. He looked uncomfortable, out of place. That made things easier. Mark stepped out of the car, his movements efficient, purposeful. No hesitation, no wasted energy. The moment Leon sensed someone approaching, he turned slightly, but he barely had time to react before Mark was beside him, gripping his arm in a way that looked casual. Just two men talking on the sidewalk, but felt like a warning. Leon stiffened instantly. Yo! Walk, Mark ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Leon hesitated. I don't. The pressure on his arm increased, just enough to send a message. Walk. Leon swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, and moved. Mark guided him away from the sidewalk, down the narrow space between two buildings where the light didn't reach. Not completely out of sight, but out of reach of prying eyes. Enough privacy to have the conversation Mark needed to have. Once they were alone, Mark let go, but his stance didn't shift. He didn't need to loom over the kid. His presence alone was enough to make Leon uneasy. I know who you run with, Mark said, his voice even, steady. I know what happened yesterday. Leon shifted his weight, his sneakers scraping against the pavement, his gaze flicking toward the mouth of the alley like he was calculating his odds of running. Mark saw it before he even moved and took a step forward, cutting off the exit without a word. Leon sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, shaking his head. Man, I don't want no trouble. Then don't make any. Mark's voice was cold, sharp, giving nothing away. Tell me about J-Rock. Leon exhaled sharply, his breath shaky, uneven. His shoulders tensed, his body language screaming hesitation. I can't, man. He finds out I've been talking. He cut himself off, shaking his head, already regretting saying too much. He won't, Mark said, his voice calm but firm. Not if you're smart. Leon rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His fingers twitched. His foot tapped restlessly against the pavement. He was scared, and for good reason. But fear made people talk just as much as it made them stay quiet. Look, Leon started, his voice lower now, as if saying it out loud made it worse. I didn't even want to be there. Some of us, he hesitated, glancing away before finally admitting the truth. We didn't want to mess with your wife. We saw she was sick, man. We ain't heartless. Mark's jaw clenched, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen, to wait. Leon let out another breath, frustration mixing with fear. J-Rock don't care about none of that. He says we do what we told, no exceptions. His voice dropped, his posture shrinking. And if we don't? Mark didn't need him to finish the sentence. He knew exactly what came next. Men like J-Rock only held power through fear, through control, through making sure that stepping out of line had consequence. Leon hesitated again, then muttered, but not all of us are like that. Mark raised an eyebrow. Who? Leon licked his lips, eyes darting toward the alley entrance before he sighed. Devin and Marcus. They ain't like the others. They don't want to be in this any more than I do. They just don't have a choice. His voice lowered, like he wasn't sure if he should be saying this. J-Rock keeps him in check the same way he does the rest of us. Fear. But if they saw a way out, Mark considered that. He wasn't looking for recruits, but knowing who in the gang wasn't loyal could be useful. They just following orders, Leon continued. They ain't the ones making the calls. Mark gave a slow nod, filing the information away. He studied Leon for a long moment. Leon swallowed hard. His jaw worked, his mind racing through possibilities, through outcomes, through what happened if he gave up the wrong name. Then, finally, he sighed, shoulders sagging under the weight of inevitability. If you go after J-Rock, man, be careful. He got more than just gangbangers. He got connections. Mark gave a single nod, his face unreadable, his tone final. So do I. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Leon didn't follow. He just stood there, exhaling slowly, watching as Mark disappeared into the night. His hands remained in his pockets, fingers twitching with nerves. He had just given up information he shouldn't have, and he knew it. Whether or not he regretted it, that was another matter entirely. When Mark went home, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant wail of a siren outside. The kitchen light cast a dim glow over the table where Vanessa sat, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She had been waiting. Mark stepped inside, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't look exhausted, but she knew him well enough to see the weight in his shoulders. He set his keys down, exhaled, and met her gaze. You're not asleep, he said. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the mug. Neither are you. Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, leaning forward with his forearms resting on the table. There was a beat of silence, just the two of them in the stillness of the night. Then, finally, Vanessa spoke. You've been out all night. Mark nodded. Had to get some information. She sighed, rubbing a tired hand over her forehead. And? Mark hesitated. He had spent years keeping parts of himself locked away from her, not out of distrust, but out of instinct. But this wasn't the time for half-truths. I found some cracks in J-Rock's crew, he admitted. Not all of them are loyal. Some of them are scared, following orders because they have to. Vanessa studied him for a moment, then set her cup down carefully. And what exactly do you plan to do with that? Mark held her gaze. I'm going to turn them. Vanessa inhaled sharply, shaking her head. Mark, this isn't just about him anymore. Mark said, his voice steady. His whole operation runs on control. Fear, if I take that away. If I give people a reason to stop following him, he falls apart. Vanessa searched his face, her jaw tightening. And what if that doesn't happen? What if all this does is make him angrier, more reckless? Mark leaned back slightly, running a hand over his chin. Then I make sure he doesn't have a way out. Her eyes darkened. What does that mean? Mark was quiet for a long moment, before he finally said, It means I don't leave anything to chance. Vanessa exhaled, shaking her head. You sound like you're going to war. Mark's lips pressed into a firm line. I am. A heavy silence settled between them. Vanessa looked down, fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her mug. You said you left that part of yourself behind, she murmured. The soldier, the man who knew how to break people down. Mark's jaw tightened. I did. She lifted her gaze to meet his. Then tell me, who are you right now? That question hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Mark leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table, his expression unreadable. I'm the man who makes sure you never have to be afraid again. Vanessa let out a breath, shaking her head. Mark, I need you to be smart about this. I know you. I know the way your mind works when you get like this. You see a target, you see an objective, and you don't stop until it's done. He didn't deny it. Her voice softened, but there was an urgency beneath it. I'm asking you, whatever you do, whatever plan you have, don't lose yourself in it. Mark studied her, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His grip was warm, solid. I won't, he promised. She held onto his hand for a moment, searching his face for something. Assurance, restraint, hope, maybe all of them. The next evening, the city pulsed around Mark, alive in its own way, breathing through the hum of street lights and the distant wail of sirens. The damp pavement glistened under flickering neon signs, the air thick with the scent of rain, exhaust, and the stale remnants of fast food. Mark moved through it like a ghost, his steps measured, his presence blending into the shadows. He had the location. He had the names. Now, he needed leverage. J-Rock's operation wasn't something he could dismantle in a single night. That wasn't how this worked. It had to be methodical, precise. He needed to shake the foundation before he brought the whole thing crashing down. That meant finding the weak spots, the ones who had hesitated, the ones who had flinched when Vanessa was on the ground. Leon had given him two names, Devon and Marcus. They weren't leaders. They weren't killers. They followed orders because they were afraid, and fear could be redirected. Mark had been trailing them for 10 minutes, keeping just far enough back to remain unseen, watching as they moved through their usual routine. The bodega wasn't the place. Too many people, too many cameras. He needed isolation, needed control. He waited, patient as ever, until they veered off onto a narrow alley behind a row of run-down apartments. Perfect. He struck before they even knew he was there. One swift step. A hand clamped over Marcus's mouth, yanking him backward into the darkness before he could make a sound. His body tensed, muscles jerking as he tried to struggle. But Mark was stronger, faster. Devon barely had time to react before an elbow drove into his ribs, the force of it knocking the air from his lungs. He doubled over with a wheeze, his hands gripping his stomach as he stumbled. Marcus tried to shout, but Mark twisted his arm behind his back, wrenching it at an angle that sent a sharp jolt of pain through his shoulder. His knees hit the ground with a dull thud, breath coming fast and panicked. Devon staggered, wide-eyed, glancing between Mark and his friend, panic creeping up his spine. Then, stupidly, he lunged. Mark moved faster, his body reacting with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Devon barely had time to register the movement before a sharp palm strike landed against his throat. Controlled, precise. The force sent him reeling against the alley wall, his hands flying up to his neck as he choked on a ragged, gasping breath. His lungs fought for air, his knees buckling slightly as he coughed, struggling to regain control. Marcus thrashed, his body jerking in a desperate attempt to free himself. But Mark's grip was iron, unyielding. He tightened his hold just enough to remind him that resistance was useless. "Don't," Mark warned, his voice quiet, almost calm. But there was no mistaking the edge underneath. Dangerous. Final. Devon groaned, still clutching his throat, his voice rough and uneven, as he wheezed out, Who the hell?" Mark ignored him. He wasn't the target. Not yet. His attention stayed locked on Marcus, the weaker of the two, the talker. "You know who I am?" Mark asked, his tone even, controlled, without a hint of emotion. Marcus gulped, his breath coming fast, uneven. Nah, man, I don't." Mark yanked his arm just a fraction tighter, just enough to send a jolt of pain up through his shoulder. Not enough to break it, not yet, but enough to make sure Marcus understood who was in control. "You were there," Mark said, his voice steady. "When she was on the ground, You saw her, and you hesitated." Devon sucked in another shaky breath, his throat still raw from the strike. But he managed to croak out, "Look, man, we didn't wanna—" "You still did," Mark cut in, his voice unyielding. He loosened his grip just slightly. "Why?" Silence, a hesitation that stretched too long. Then Marcus cracked. "It was J-Rock," he blurted, the words tumbling out fast, frantic. "It was all J-Rock, man. We just do what we're told." Mark's grip loosened just enough to let Marcus breathe. "Go on." Devon, still rubbing at his throat, exhaled sharply. "Some of us, we ain't like that. We saw she was sick. We saw the scarf." His voice trailed off, his head shaking slightly. "But J-Rock? He don't give a damn. He said we do what we told. No exceptions." Marcus nodded quickly, words spilling out in a rush. "We ain't have a choice, man. If we said no," Mark's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew what happened to those who questioned J-Rock. Fear was his weapon, and now it was Mark's. "You have a choice now," Mark said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You either stay under his boot, or you start thinking for yourself." His words hung in the cold night air, pressing down on them like a weight. There was no anger in his tone, no threat, just fact. Marcus swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. His eyes darted to Devon, looking for some kind of reassurance, but all he found was the same uncertainty reflected back at him. "Man, we can't just walk away," he muttered, his voice low, almost defeated. "You can," Mark countered simply. "You just have to decide if you will." A long silence stretched between them, thick with hesitation. The city hummed in the background, distant car horns, the faint echo of music from a passing car, the occasional shuffle of feet on pavement. But here, in this alley, everything else faded. It was just them. A moment. A decision. Devon cracked first. His shoulders sagged slightly, his hands flexing at his sides before he finally spoke. "J-Rock's got shipments coming in," he admitted, his voice quiet but certain. "Guns. Big ones. He got people bringing them to the auto shop." That got Mark's full attention. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted just slightly. A weapons shipment. A major deal. A weak point. Marcus shot Devon a glare, but he didn't deny it. He knew the truth was already out. Mark released his hold on them, stepping back, letting them breathe. "You just made a good decision," he told them, his tone as even as before. Devon and Marcus exchanged a glance. They were shaken, rattled by what had just happened, but something in their eyes was different now. Uncertainty, doubt, maybe even the first traces of regret. They weren't blind followers anymore, not completely. Before Mark turned to leave, he met their eyes, his expression unreadable, his voice calm. "J-Rock's time is running out. Figure out what side you want to be on when it does." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Mark was gone. Later, he sat in his car, parked across from an empty lot, the glow of the dashboard screen casting faint shadows across his face. He replayed the conversation in his mind, committing every detail to memory. A weapons shipment, an auto shop, a perfect pressure point. But he couldn't take on J-Rock alone, not yet. He needed someone on the inside. He needed Leon. Leon wasn't hard to find. He never was. Mark had been watching him for the past 2 nights, tracking his movements, studying his routine, and Leon had no idea. The kid was slipping. His hesitation was obvious. He lingered on the edges of J-Rock's crew, hanging back when others moved forward, keeping his head down, but never fully blending in. He was caught between 2 worlds, too deep to walk away, but already questioning whether he wanted to stay. He just needed a push. And Mark was going to give it to him. Tonight, Leon was alone. He sat slumped on a rusted bench near an abandoned bus stop, hood pulled low over his head, legs spread apart, fingers drumming anxiously against his knee. His eyes kept darting around, scanning the empty street, watching shadows like he expected something, or someone, to come for him. He already looked like a man who had decided he didn't want to be here anymore. Mark approached silently, his footsteps light, his presence undetectable until he sat down beside him. No warning, no hesitation. Leon flinched, his body jerking slightly as he turned, eyes widening. "The hell? Relax," Mark muttered, his voice low, steady. "If I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be talking." Leon froze, his muscles going rigid as his brain caught up to what was happening. His fingers twitched, and for a second, Mark could see the thought cross his mind. Run, fight, do something. But instead, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. His voice was tight when he finally spoke. "What do you want?" Mark leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. His voice was calm, measured, giving nothing away. "You already know." Leon let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "Man, I already told you what I know. You told me where J-Rock operates." Mark cut him off, his tone precise, leaving no room for argument. "I need more." Leon scoffed, his defenses rising, a weak attempt at bravado. "Why would I help you?" Mark turned his head slightly, studying him, letting the moment stretch. Then, just as evenly, he said, "Because you're already thinking about it." Silence. Leon shifted, his weight moving uncomfortably on the bench. He clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead, like the answer might be written somewhere in the cracked pavement. "J-Rock finds out, he won't." Mark's response was sharp, cutting through the excuse before Leon could even finish it. Leon's fingers curled into fists. His jaw worked as he ground his teeth, frustration battling against the truth he wasn't ready to say. "You don't get it, man. You don't just—" "You hesitated." Mark's voice was quieter now, deliberate, pressing into the cracks. "You knew what was happening to my wife was wrong. You wanted to stop it. But you didn't." Leon flinched, his jaw tightening. But Mark wasn't done. His words weren't just meant to be heard. They were meant to sink in, to linger, to force Leon to face the truth he had been avoiding. "So, here's your chance," Mark continued, his tone unwavering. "You can keep telling yourself you don't have a choice, or you can actually do something that matters." Leon exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. His gaze dropped to the ground, unfocused, as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. Mark didn't push. No more words, no more pressure. Just silence. Then, finally, Leon broke. "I don't want this life," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." Mark nodded once. Good. The kid still had a conscience. That was something he could work with. Then, without hesitation, he laid out the plan. Leon listened, head down, nodding occasionally, his mind processing every detail. Mark had no interest in playing fair. "This doesn't end with me walking in and throwing punches," Mark said, his voice firm. "We do this right. We rip him apart from the inside." Leon swallowed hard, shifting slightly. "How?" Mark's eyes were sharp, unyielding. "We turn his own people against him." Leon let out a sharp breath, rubbing the back of his head. "J-Rock keeps everyone in line. You go against him, you're done. So let's make them realize," Mark said, leaning in just slightly, "that he's not as untouchable as he thinks." Leon hesitated, his fingers flexing against his knees. "Man, I don't know." Mark gave him one last push. "You do nothing, and J-Rock stays in power. He'll keep making you do worse and worse until there's no coming back." His voice was low, cutting, pushing right where it needed to. Leon's fingers curled into fists. Mark continued, "You start choosing your own fate." A long, tense silence filled the space between them. Then Leon exhaled, slow and steady, and nodded. "I'm in." The first step was planting seeds of doubt. Leon knew exactly which members were already uneasy. Devin and Marcus were just the beginning. There were others, the ones who followed orders because they were afraid, the ones who never spoke up but hesitated just a second too long when things got ugly. J-Rock relied on control, on fear, on the assumption that no one would dare step out of line. But fear could be turned against him. Leon worked carefully, moving in the spaces where J-Rock wasn't looking. Quiet conversations in dark corners, whispered warnings that left lingering thoughts, small pushes in the right direction. "Yo, man, you ever think about how J-Rock don't care about who gets hurt? It's always us taking the heat. You really think he got your back? He'd throw any one of us under the bus if it meant saving his own ass. Man, I don't know. Something about this whole thing don't sit right." Doubt. It spread like a virus, slow at first, almost invisible, but once it took root, it grew. And J-Rock's crew was starting to fracture, not enough to make him notice yet, but enough to weaken him. Mark and Leon had every key detail locked in now. Some of his own men were already questioning him. Now, Mark just had to strike. J-Rock had been in the game too long to ignore the signs. Something was shifting beneath him, and he didn't like it. His crew wasn't moving the way they used to. Too much hesitation, too many sideways glances. He had spent years making sure no one dared to question his orders. And now, suddenly, there was doubt. He wasn't stupid. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to turn his own people against him. That wasn't going to happen. He stood in the back of his auto shop, leaning against the frame of an old car, while the sounds of wrenches and grinding metal filled the air. He let his gaze scan the room, taking mental inventory of who was there and who wasn't. Marcus and Devin had been scarce, and Leon had been keeping his head down. That wasn't a coincidence. J-Rock flicked his chin at Darius, his most trusted enforcer, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Somebody out there think they can play games with me. I need you to remind them how this works." Darius nodded, his expression unreadable. "You want 'em gone?" J-Rock smirked, shaking his head. "Not gone. Hurt. I want 'em to understand what happens when you step out of line." Darius didn't hesitate. He rounded up 4 of his best guys, the ones who didn't ask questions, who carried out orders without hesitation. It didn't take long for them to find out who had been stirring things up. Mark Williams. Mark had been watching them for days, waiting for the moment they made their move. He had seen the same faces trailing him, the same car parked a block away from his house, the same men who thought they were being discreet. He had spent too much time dealing with threats in war zones to miss the signs. The difference was, in war, men who scouted their target usually didn't make it back. He knew they were coming, so he gave them exactly what they wanted. Leading them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, he made sure they thought they had him cornered. The building had been sitting empty for years, its metal beams rusted and the air thick with dust. No security cameras, no one around to hear what was about to happen. By the time Darius and his men stepped inside, Mark was already waiting. The door creaked as the first man entered, glancing around warily. The others followed, their footsteps cautious, scanning the darkness ahead. Darius was the last to step inside, gun drawn, his jaw tight with focus. "Williams," he called, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We know you here, man. You've been real busy, haven't you?" Silence. Then the lights cut out. Panic rippled through the group. Someone muttered a curse under his breath. Another reached for his weapon, shifting uneasily. A scuffle broke out in the darkness, a grunt of pain, a heavy thud. "What the—" Before the words finished, a second body hit the ground. Darius turned sharply, his pulse hammering. "Stay together," he hissed. Then, from the shadows, Mark's voice. "Should have brought more men." Darius swung his gun toward the sound, but Mark was already moving. A hard strike to the wrist sent the weapon clattering to the ground. Another quick motion, Mark's elbow slamming into his ribs, sent Darius stumbling back. One of the others charged blindly. Mark sidestepped, catching the man's arm and twisting it behind his back before driving him into a rusted beam with brutal efficiency. Another attacker pulled a knife, lunging forward. Mark intercepted him smoothly, knocking the blade free and following with a precise strike to the ribs. The man groaned as he collapsed to the ground. The last remaining man hesitated, glancing between his fallen crew and Mark. A choice hung in the air. He made the right one. He bolted. Darius was breathing hard, clutching his ribs as he struggled to stand. He watched as Mark crouched down, picking up his discarded gun and ejecting the magazine before tossing it aside. Mark met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Go tell J-Rock," he said evenly. This was his warning. Darius hesitated for a long moment before stumbling toward the exit, disappearing into the night. Mark didn't move until the sound of his retreating footsteps faded. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Darius staggered back into the auto shop, his lips split, his shirt torn, and his breath ragged. The second J-Rock saw him, his grin disappeared. "What happened?" Darius wiped at his mouth, shaking his head. "It's him," he muttered. "Ain't just some dude, Jay. He took us apart like we was nothing." J-Rock narrowed his eyes, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest of the chair he was sitting in. His mind was already working, piecing together what this meant. He had underestimated Mark. Big mistake. Slowly, he exhaled, flexing his fingers. "All right," he murmured. "Enough of this cat-and-mouse shit." He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. "This ain't just about some warning anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I want him hurt. I want him to know that when you come at me, you don't walk away whole." There was silence on the other end of the call, then a short response. "It's done." J-Rock hung up, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see how much fight this dude really got." The next morning, the police station operated like it always did. Phones ringing in an endless cycle, tired officers shifting between desks with coffee cups in one hand and paperwork in the other, the stale scent of burnt coffee and ink thick in the air. There was a rhythm to it, a slow-moving, never-ending machine churning through cases that would likely never see the inside of a courtroom. Another day, another crime that would slip through the cracks, another victim who would be told to wait. Vanessa Williams didn't have time for waiting. She didn't have time for bureaucracy, for half-hearted excuses, for a system that had already failed her once. She walked in with a purpose, cutting through the station's routine like a blade, moving with the kind of quiet determination that turned heads, not to ask, not to beg. She had done that before, and she had nothing left to give. She was done waiting. Detective Lisa Monroe was seated at her desk, eyes flicking across a report, already weary from the cases stacked around her. She barely had time to glance up before Vanessa was standing in front of her, her presence so sharp and unwavering that it made Monroe straighten instinctively. Vanessa wasn't here for pleasantries, and her voice cut through the background noise like a warning shot. "You need to arrest J-Rock." Monroe let out a slow, measured breath before leaning back in her chair, already anticipating the fight. "Mrs. Williams, don't." The word came out fast, firm, a single syllable weighted with weeks of frustration and loss. Vanessa's hands curled into fists against the desk, her knuckles pressing into the worn wood. Mark already made his move. You had your chance to stop this before it started. Now, I'm telling you, it's only getting worse. Monroe's expression shifted, the neutral professionalism on her face giving way to something sharper, more alert. Her back straightened slightly, and for the first time, she truly studied Vanessa. The tension in her shoulders, the fire barely restrained in her eyes, the way her breath came too tightly controlled. "What exactly did he do?" Monroe asked. Her voice clipped, her tone edged with something between concern and inevitability. Vanessa exhaled, and it was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion, frustration, and something heavier beneath the surface. What he had to. Monroe let out a slow breath, her fingers pressing against her temple. There it was, the moment she had been dreading. She had known this would happen. She had known from the moment Mark Williams stepped into her office days ago. His voice too calm, his presence too still, his words too deliberate. A man like him, a man with his kind of past, wasn't going to wait around for justice to move at the speed of paperwork. Damn it, Vanessa. Monroe finally spoke, her voice lower now, her tone carrying a weight of its own. You know, if Mark keeps pushing, there's no coming back from this. Vanessa's jaw tightened, her entire body tensing like a coil wound too tight. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady but raw, like something frayed at the edges. J-Rock beat me, detective. The words weren't loud, but they landed heavy. He left me on the ground like I was nothing. And you let him. Monroe flinched, just slightly, just for a second. But Vanessa caught it. For the first time, Monroe wasn't just looking at her as another case number or another witness to a crime that would be shuffled into a pile of unsolved files. She saw the bruises that had long since faded, but still ached beneath Vanessa's skin. She saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the fight in her stance, the way she carried the weight of what had been done to her like armor. Vanessa shook her head, the words catching in her throat before she forced them out. So, don't you dare talk to me about coming back. My husband is doing your job for you, and we both know how that ends. Monroe's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to say. She reached for her phone, pressing her lips together as she prepared to make the call. I'll make the call. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin, almost unreadable line. She had already known what Monroe would say. She had already known it wouldn't matter. You do that, she said, her voice hollow, flat, as if the conversation was already over. She turned without another word and walked out of the station, her steps steady, unhurried, but final. Monroe sat frozen for a long moment, watching her leave, listening to the faint echo of her heels clicking against the tile floor. Then she exhaled, her grip loosening around the phone as she stared at the case file in front of her. She could make all the calls she wanted. She could send out warrants and put pressure on the right people, but the truth was written all over Vanessa's face. This wasn't ending in an arrest. Mark Williams was going to end it himself. Mark had seen power structures crumble before. It never happened all at once. It started with whispers, small shifts in movement, the subtle hesitation of those who once followed without question. J-Rock had ruled through fear for years, keeping his people in check with threats and violence, but fear had a limit. The moment people realized their leader wasn't invincible, the moment they saw weakness, the unraveling began. That moment had arrived. Word of Mark's takedown of Darius and his crew spread fast. J-Rock had expected his retaliation to send a message, to make an example out of Mark. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had exposed the cracks, the fractures in his foundation, the truth that had been lurking in the minds of his people for a long time. J-Rock wasn't untouchable, and if Mark Williams could take down his enforcers without breaking a sweat, maybe J-Rock's grip on the streets wasn't as strong as he thought. The first to fold was Trey, a mid-level crew member who had been with J-Rock for years, but had never been trusted enough to get too close. Mark wasn't surprised when he showed up at the warehouse Leon had arranged for their meeting. Trey was a survivor. He knew how to read the tides, and he wasn't about to go down with a sinking ship. "This ain't worth it no more," Trey muttered, keeping his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. J-Rock acting like he's still running things, but everyone feeling it. Darius getting wrecked like that. Man, people don't know what to think no more. Mark leaned back against the metal table, arms crossed, waiting. He had learned a long time ago that silence was a weapon. The more he let them talk, the more they revealed. Trey exhaled sharply. "There's others feeling the same way," he continued. "They just scared to say something." J-Rock ain't stupid. He knows people been talking. He pushing harder than ever, trying to make sure nobody steps out of line. But that's just making people want to run more. It was exactly what Mark had been waiting for. Over the next 24 hours, more of J-Rock's crew started breaking away. Some came quietly, slipping out of the auto shop and into the shadows, making their way to Mark's side. Others were more careful, still tangled in J-Rock's network, but ready to jump ship when the time was right. Then came the most important piece of information yet. Leon had been quiet for most of the night, listening to the conversations unfold, taking in the shifting dynamics. But when the others had left, he turned to Mark, his expression tense. "I know where he's holed up," Leon said. Mark didn't ask him to elaborate. He just waited. Leon rubbed a hand over his face. J-Rock been laying low at the Pit, that old rundown club near the docks. It's where he's been moving product, where he handles business. It ain't as locked down as the shop, but he thinks no one would be dumb enough to come at him there. Mark processed the information quickly. J-Rock's biggest mistake wasn't just underestimating him. It was believing that no one would dare challenge him in his own space. A club was different from a warehouse. It wasn't a fortress. It was chaotic, unpredictable, full of weak points and escape routes. That could work for J-Rock, but it could also work against him. Mark nodded. "He keeps a lot of men there?" Leon shook his head. "Not as many as you'd think. He got people moving in and out, but most his muscles still out in the streets, trying to keep people from bouncing on him. If we move right, we can catch him before he even knows what's happening." J-Rock was smart, but he was too focused on plugging leaks in his crew to see the bigger threat looming over him. That was his second mistake. By the next morning, Mark had already started setting the pieces in motion. This wasn't going to be a reckless charge. It would be precise, methodical, and absolute. The warehouse was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from a flickering bulb overhead, and the glow of streetlights filtering through broken windows. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, and the quiet murmurs of men who had, until recently, called J-Rock their leader. Mark stood at the center, his expression unreadable as he studied the faces around him. These men weren't soldiers, not in the way he had trained with, but they were survivors. They had spent years in the streets, learning to navigate a world built on power and fear. The fact that they were here now, standing against the man who had once ruled them, meant they had already made their decision. They just needed a plan. Leon leaned against a stack of crates, his arms crossed as he spoke first. "J-Rock still don't know how deep this goes. He think people just scared, that all the whisperin' is just noise. But if we move now, before he catches on, we can take him before he even knows what's happening." Mark nodded, letting the words settle before responding. "We're not walking in blind. We do this clean, fast. No warning, no second chances. If J-Rock realizes we're coming before we're in place, we lose any advantage we have." Trey, one of the newer defectors, ran a hand over his face. "The Pit ain't built like the auto shop. Place is open, lot of exits, but if we don't move right, we lose him. He ain't the type to stick around when things get heavy." Mark turned his gaze toward him. "Then we make sure he has nowhere to go." The plan unfolded piece by piece. Phase 1. Isolate the club. The Pit had several entrances, one main door, a side alley access, and a back exit that led straight to a loading dock near the water. J-Rock had used it as a quick way to move product in and out without drawing too much attention. Mark knew that would be his first escape route if things went wrong. That meant cutting it off. A group of men would position themselves near the back, blending in with the usual crowd of night workers who loitered near the docks. The moment J-Rock tried to slip out, they'd be waiting. Phase 2. Control the inside. Leon and a few of the others still had ties inside. They could walk in without raising suspicion, position themselves before the action started. The key was to move quietly until the right moment. J-Rock's men were already wary, already questioning things. They just needed the right push. Phase 3. Take him down. J-Rock thrived in chaos, but only when he was the one controlling it. If they stripped that from him, took away his options before he even realized he was trapped, he wouldn't have time to think, only to react. And reaction, Mark knew, led to mistakes. The plan was simple, but execution would be everything. Mark looked around the room, letting the silence stretch, reading the faces before him. Some were tense, some were determined, most were afraid. He didn't blame them. This was the moment where lines were drawn, where there was no turning back. "You don't have to do this," Mark said finally. "J-Rock's losing power, but he's still dangerous. If any of you want to walk away now, do it. No one will stop you." No one moved. Leon smirked, shaking his head. "Ain't nobody walking away, man. Not after everything." That was all Mark needed to hear. The night stretched on, each hour bringing them closer to the moment everything would shift. The pit was still active, music thumping through the walls, men coming and going without realizing the walls were closing in around them. Mark stood outside, watching from a distance as Leon and the others slipped inside, blending in as they positioned themselves. A truck rumbled down the street, slowing as it neared the back entrance. That was their team moving into place, cutting off J-Rock's easiest way out. Every piece was falling into position. Mark adjusted the grip on his jacket, his mind calm despite the tension crackling in the air. He had been in situations like this before, waiting for the right moment, knowing that once it came, there was no going back. Trey's voice came over the small earpiece they had rigged together from burner phones. "We're in. He's at his usual spot, back booth near the bar. Got 2 of his guys close." Mark's pulse remained steady. "Wait for my signal." From his position, he could see the movements of the club through the reflection of a glass window across the street. The night was alive, unaware that, within minutes, everything inside was about to change. A slow inhale, a steady exhale. This was it. The bass from the club's speakers thumped through the walls, rattling the air with deep, pulsing vibrations. From the outside, the pit looked like any other rundown establishment near the docks. A dimly lit dive where hustlers, dealers, and enforcers came to drink, scheme, and do business in the shadows. Inside, however, it was something else entirely. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of sweat and cheap liquor mixing into a heavy fog. The crowd was dense, bodies moving to the rhythm of music, some lost in conversation, while others watched everything around them with the quiet suspicion that came with living on the edge of violence. J-Rock sat in his usual booth near the back, one arm draped over the worn leather seat, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. A drink sat untouched in front of him, condensation pooling at the base of the glass. His eyes, however, weren't on the drink. They were scanning the room, tracking movements, waiting. He knew something was coming, but he was looking for the wrong threat. Near the bar, Leon leaned against the counter, head low, blending into the crowd. He had been inside for nearly 20 minutes, long enough to get a read on the energy in the room. J-Rock's men were tense. Some were drinking more than usual, others speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flickering toward their boss every few seconds. Leon caught Trey's glance from across the room. Everything was set. He pressed his phone once, sending a silent signal to Mark. Outside, Mark stood in the alley beside the club, his breathing slow, measured. He could feel the energy inside, the moment of stillness before everything shattered. He turned his head slightly, signaling the men near the back entrance. They moved into place without a word, blocking the loading dock J-Rock would use to escape if things turned bad. Then, without hesitation, Mark pushed the door open and stepped inside. The shift in the room was subtle at first, a slow ripple of recognition as people glanced toward the entrance, their minds taking a moment to register what they were seeing. Mark didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. J-Rock's fingers stopped tapping. The tension in the air snapped tight. Mark walked forward with calm, unhurried steps, his expression unreadable. The crowd instinctively parted as he moved, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The weight of his presence was enough to stir unease. He wasn't posturing, wasn't trying to make a scene. He simply existed in a way that made it clear he wasn't afraid. J-Rock's grip tightened on the armrest. "You lost." His voice carried through the space, casual, but with an undercurrent of warning. Mark stopped a few feet from the booth. He let the silence settle. Let the weight of his presence sink into the room. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and even. "You know why I'm here." J-Rock chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "You got some nerve. Walking in here like you run the place." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You think just 'cause you took out a few of my guys, you untouchable?" Mark didn't respond. Instead, he let his eyes sweep the room, noting the small shifts. Men adjusting their weight, hands twitching toward weapons, the way some of them weren't fully committed to moving yet. Hesitation. That was the key. "You built this place on fear," Mark said finally, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the music. "That worked for a while. But fear doesn't last. You know that." J-Rock's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Mark took another step forward. "You feel it, don't you? Your people slipping through your fingers. You're holding on so tight you can't even see how many have already let go." A muscle in J-Rock's jaw twitched. He glanced toward the bar, toward the shadows where Leon stood. His lips parted slightly, realizing just how many of his own men weren't standing with him anymore. For the first time, Mark saw doubt flicker in his eyes. It lasted only a moment before J-Rock pushed himself to his feet, rolling his shoulders, shaking off whatever uncertainty had crept in. "You think you come in here, throw some words around, and I just roll over?" His voice was louder now, cutting through the room. "You think I don't know who I'm dealing with?" His gaze hardened. "I ain't scared of you." Mark didn't blink. "You should be." J-Rock's hand moved. It was instinct, reaching for the gun tucked beneath his jacket. The kind of motion that came from years of living in a world where survival was dictated by who pulled the trigger first. But Mark was faster. Before J-Rock could draw his weapon, Mark closed the distance, grabbing his wrist in a brutal, twisting motion that forced the gun free. It clattered against the table, sliding across the floor. The room exploded. J-Rock's men surged forward, some out of loyalty, others out of panic. Leon and the others moved just as fast, intercepting them before they could reach Mark. Fists cracked against jaws, bodies collided against tables and chairs, glass shattered against the floor. Mark didn't focus on the chaos around him. His grip was locked around J-Rock's arm, twisting him forward, slamming him onto the table with enough force to rattle the bottles on it. J-Rock struggled, elbow swinging back, catching Mark's ribs, but Mark didn't let go. He wrenched him upright, spun him around, and drove him backward against the wall. The music was still blaring, but the fight was already shifting. The ones who had turned against J-Rock weren't just fighting. They were winning. J-Rock knew it too. Mark could see it in his eyes. The realization that, for the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. The chaos inside the pit had reached its peak. Fists cracked against jaws, tables overturned, glass shattered against the concrete floor. J-Rock's men, the ones still loyal enough or too afraid to turn, were losing ground. The balance had shifted. Leon and the others fought with a determination that came from knowing they were free of J-Rock's grip the moment he fell. But Mark wasn't focused on them. His world had narrowed to the man in front of him. J-Rock had shoved away from the wall, staggering but still standing. His face twisted in rage, the glint of sweat catching under the neon glow of the club lights. He rolled his shoulders, his breath heavy, and eyed Mark like a cornered animal ready to bite. "You think you something special?" J-Rock sneered, wiping a trail of blood from the corner of his mouth. "Think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't waste words on men like J-Rock. The fight wasn't over. J-Rock moved first, lunging forward, his fist swinging in a wild arc. It was meant to be fast, unpredictable. But Mark had seen real combat. He knew what a desperate man looked like in a fight, and J-Rock was nothing if not desperate. Mark sidestepped at the last second, the punch barely grazing his shoulder. Before J-Rock could recover, Mark delivered a sharp, precise strike to his ribs. J-Rock grunted in pain, but instead of stepping back, he used the momentum to drive his knee up, aiming for Mark's gut. Mark caught the movement too late. The impact landed hard, knocking the air from his lungs, sending him stumbling back a step. J-Rock smirked, breathing heavy. "That all you got?" Mark didn't reply. Instead, he surged forward, grabbing J-Rock by the front of his jacket and slamming him into the nearest table. The cheap wood splintered under the weight, sending drinks and broken glass flying. J-Rock lashed out, his fist connecting with Mark's jaw. Pain exploded across Mark's face, but he didn't loosen his grip. He could feel J-Rock trying to squirm free, trying to slip away. Mark responded by grabbing the back of his head and driving his skull into the table's surface once, twice, just enough to rattle his bones. J-Rock spat blood, groaning as he pushed himself off the wreckage. He was slower now, his movements sluggish, but there was still fight in him. Mark watched as J-Rock reached for something inside his jacket. Another weapon. Maybe a knife. Mark didn't give him the chance. He grabbed J-Rock's wrist before he could pull the weapon free, twisting it sharply. The sound of bones popping was lost in the noise of the room, but the way J-Rock screamed was unmistakable. Mark wrenched his arm further, bringing J-Rock to his knees. "You're done," Mark said, his voice steady, controlled. J-Rock gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his forehead. "You don't get it," he panted, his breath uneven. "There ain't no done in this life. You take me out, someone else steps up. That's how it works." Mark tightened his grip. "Not this time." J-Rock let out a strangled laugh, shaking his head even as he knelt on the ground, broken and bleeding. "So what? You gonna kill me now? That the plan?" Mark's fingers flexed, his instincts screaming at him to finish it. He had fought men like J-Rock before, men who ruled through violence and fear, men who never changed. If he ended this here, no one would blame him. The world would be better without J-Rock in it. But that wasn't justice. That was vengeance. And vengeance wouldn't bring Vanessa peace. Mark let out a slow breath before releasing J-Rock's wrist and stepping back. J-Rock looked up, his body wrecked, his pride shattered, disbelief flickering across his face. He had been expecting the killing blow, the final end. Instead, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. J-Rock's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "You serious?" Mark didn't answer as he dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" Mark kept his eyes locked on J-Rock as he spoke. "I have a man here wanted for multiple assaults, drug trafficking, and attempted murder. You're gonna want to send backup." J-Rock let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Man, cops ain't gonna keep me locked up. You know how this works." Mark gave him a knowing look. "Not this time." The sirens were already closing in. The moment J-Rock's own men had realized the fight was lost, they had scattered, slipping into the night like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The pit was emptying fast, leaving only those too injured to run and those too loyal or too stupid to know when to quit. J-Rock sighed, defeated, as he slumped against the floor, his head rolling back against the broken table leg. "Guess you won, huh?" he muttered. Mark didn't answer. He already knew the truth. The flashing red and blue lights painted the crumbling walls of the pit, casting long shadows as officers moved through the wreckage of the fight. The air was thick with the lingering scent of sweat, alcohol, and blood. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, some groaning in pain, others too exhausted or beaten to move. The music had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the static of police radios and the occasional barked command. Mark stood just outside the club's entrance, his body still tense from the fight, watching as the last of J-Rock's men were rounded up. Some had chosen to make a run for it the second they saw the flashing lights, disappearing into the night like cockroaches scattering when the lights flicked on. Others, knowing the game was over, had dropped their weapons and raised their hands before the officers even reached them. Leon stood a few feet away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. He had spent years under J-Rock's rule, living by his rules, carrying out his orders. Now, for the first time, those rules no longer existed. Detective Lisa Monroe arrived just as two officers dragged J-Rock, bloodied and barely able to walk, toward the waiting patrol car. He didn't fight them. He didn't curse or spit or threaten. He just laughed, low and bitter, shaking his head as if this was all just another inconvenience. Monroe stopped beside Mark, her arms crossed as she watched J-Rock get shoved into the back seat. "Never thought I'd see the day," she muttered. Mark didn't respond. He had nothing to say to J-Rock anymore. Monroe turned her attention to him, studying him for a long moment before sighing. "I don't know exactly what went down in there," she said, nodding toward the club. "But I do know one thing. This city's gonna sleep a little easier tonight because of you." Mark exhaled slowly. "That wasn't the plan." "No," Monroe agreed, "but it's what happened." She glanced toward the group of former gang members standing at a distance. Trey, Marcus, Devin, and a few others who had turned against J-Rock in the final hours. They weren't in cuffs. They weren't running. They were waiting. Leon finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "We ain't trying to run the streets like J-Rock did. We ain't trying to pick up where he left off." He looked at Mark, then back at Monroe. "We're gonna fix this place. We're gonna make it better." Monroe arched an eyebrow. "That so?" Leon nodded. "We've been part of the problem too long. Time we did something different." She considered that for a moment, then sighed. "Fine, but if I even get a whisper of you running anything illegal, I'll be coming for you next." Leon smirked. "Wouldn't expect anything less." Monroe shook her head and turned back to Mark. "You need anything, you know where to find me." Mark watched as she walked off, disappearing into the mess of flashing lights and uniforms. The moment she was gone, Leon turned toward him, his smirk fading into something more serious. "You ain't sticking around, are you?" Mark shook his head. "Was never my fight to stay in." Leon nodded, as if he had already known the answer. "Guess I owe you for not leaving me to deal with J-Rock alone." "You don't owe me anything," Mark said. "Just make sure you don't waste the chance you got." Leon offered his hand. Mark took it, giving a firm shake before turning away and walking into the night. The house was dark when Mark pulled into the driveway, the engine humming softly before shutting off. For the first time in days, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He was tired, physically, mentally, but the weight pressing down on him was lighter now. Inside, the warm glow of a small lamp illuminated the living room. Vanessa sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders, a cup of tea resting between her hands. She looked up when she heard the door open, her eyes soft, searching. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Mark stepped toward her, dropping onto the couch beside her. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I am now." She studied him for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "It's over?" Mark nodded. "It's over." Vanessa closed her eyes for a second, absorbing the words, letting them sink in. When she opened them again, the worry that had lingered there for days was finally gone. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for me. For you." Mark rested his hand over hers, squeezing gently. "You don't have to be scared anymore." She nodded, then leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. For the first time since the attack, since everything that followed, she felt safe. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. The first morning after it was all over felt different. The air outside was still crisp, the neighborhood still waking up. But there was a quietness that hadn't been there before. No more murmurs of J-Rock's crew on the corners, no more tension simmering beneath the surface. For the first time in a long time, the streets felt settled. Inside their home, Mark and Vanessa sat at the kitchen table, the soft clink of coffee cups the only sound between them for a while. Neither spoke right away, and for once, they didn't need to. Mark had been up before sunrise, moving through the house, reacquainting himself with the stillness. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of peace. Vanessa reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "It feels real now," she murmured. Mark turned his hand palm up, lacing his fingers with hers. "It is real," he assured her. She studied his face, taking in the healing bruises, the small cuts along his knuckles. The exhaustion still settled in his eyes. "But you're not," she said quietly. "Not completely." Mark exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He understood what she meant. The past few days had been spent cleaning up someone else's mess, righting a wrong, making sure Vanessa was safe. But now there was nothing left to fight. No enemy waiting in the shadows, no war on the horizon. And for a man who had spent his life in battle, first overseas, then in the streets, that kind of stillness was unfamiliar. Vanessa gave his hand a squeeze, drawing him back. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," she said. "You just have to be here." Mark let out a slow breath, nodding. "I am." She smiled softly. "Good, because I need you here, Mark. Not out there chasing ghosts. Not carrying every fight on your back." His jaw tightened slightly, instinct pulling him toward an argument he didn't want to have. But then he looked at her. Really looked at her. The way the lines of worry on her face had softened. The way she held herself without tension for the first time in weeks. She wasn't just asking him to stay. She was asking him to let it go. "I will always protect you," he promised, his voice low but steady, no matter what. Vanessa's smile didn't fade, but her eyes searched his. "And what happens when there's no one left to protect me from?" Mark didn't have an answer for that, but as Vanessa squeezed his hand once more and turned back to her coffee, he realized he had time to figure it out. While Mark was learning how to be still, Leon was already moving. It had only been a few days since J-Rock was locked up, but the effects of his downfall rippled fast. His remaining crew had scattered, most of them either skipping town or fading into the background, unwilling to be part of the inevitable fallout. But there was a power vacuum, and Mark had warned Leon what would happen if someone else tried to fill it. So instead of waiting for the next J-Rock to rise up, Leon took control of the conversation first. It started small, a meeting at a local rec center, just a handful of faces, some of them younger kids who had grown up idolizing men like J-Rock, some of them older, the ones who had spent too many years in the life, and were starting to wonder if it was too late to change. Leon stood in front of them, hands in his pockets, his voice steady but raw. "I ain't here to preach. I ain't here to tell you how to live your life, but I do know that if we don't start doing something different, we all just end up like him." A few heads turned, some nodding, some skeptical. One of the younger kids, maybe 16 at most, scoffed. "Man, J-Rock ran these streets for years. You really think you can just erase all that?" Leon shook his head. "Nah, ain't about erasing it. It's about making sure we don't keep repeating the same damn mistakes." He saw the hesitation in their eyes, the same doubt he had once carried. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight. That change never came easy. But this was the first step. Over the next few weeks, Leon worked with local programs to set up mentorships, job training, alternatives to gang life. He pulled in people who had once been deep in the streets and were now looking for a way out. He gave them purpose, something J-Rock never did. And the city, it noticed. For the first time in a long time, the cycle was starting to break. The last time Mark and Leon crossed paths was outside the rec center, just as one of the afternoon sessions was wrapping up. Mark leaned against his car, arms crossed as he watched a few kids trickle out, laughing and talking amongst themselves. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Leon walked over, stopping beside him. "Didn't think you were the type to check up on people," he said, smirking. Mark shrugged. "I wanted to see if you were full of crap." Leon chuckled, shaking his head. "And?" Mark let his gaze drift back toward the center, watching as a few kids stayed behind, talking with some of the older guys who had once run the streets, men who had finally found a reason to do something different. "You might actually pull this off," Mark admitted. Leon exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ain't easy. Some days I feel like it's working. Some days I feel like it's just a matter of time before someone else steps in and messes it all up. Mark glanced at him. Then make sure they don't. Leon nodded, his expression serious. That the advice you giving me? No. Mark straightened up, pushing off the car. That's the warning. Leon smirked. Noted. Mark turned toward his car, pausing just before he opened the door. Take care of yourself, Leon. Leon gave him a nod. You too, old man. Mark rolled his eyes, but a small smile tugged at his lips as he pulled out of the parking lot. The streets weren't perfect. They never would be. But they were better than they had been, and sometimes that was enough. The heavy clank of the prison gate echoed through the long, dimly lit corridor. The air inside was thick, stale, the kind of oppressive stillness that made time feel slower. J-Rock sat on the edge of his cot, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. His once pristine sneakers were scuffed, his clothes wrinkled from too many hours spent in a holding cell before the transfer. The reality of his situation had settled in long before this moment, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. He had lost everything. His crew had either flipped on him, scattered, or were sitting in other cells just like this one, awaiting their own fates. The empire he had spent years building, the control he had held over the streets, was gone. And worse than that, the respect, the fear that had once kept his name untouchable had vanished. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. It wasn't supposed to end like this. A guard's voice cut through the silence. Let's go. J-Rock looked up, his expression unreadable before standing. The chains around his wrists rattled as he moved, the weight of them unfamiliar. He had never been the one shackled before. He had always been the one holding the chains. As he stepped forward, flanked by officers, he caught sight of a figure standing just beyond the bars. Mark. J-Rock smirked, though it lacked any real confidence. Came to see me off? Mark didn't say anything at first, just studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no smugness, no celebration, just finality. J-Rock scoffed. You really think this changes anything? You think this city gonna be different just 'cause I ain't out there? He shook his head, his smirk fading. Ain't how it works, man. Somebody always steps up. Mark finally spoke, his voice calm. Not this time. J-Rock laughed, a low, bitter sound. You really believe that? Mark didn't blink. Yeah. Something in J-Rock's expression shifted, just for a second. Doubt. The guards nudged him forward. He didn't fight it. He kept his gaze locked on Mark for as long as he could, searching for something, trying to find a weakness, a crack in the man who had brought him down. But there was nothing, just a quiet certainty. J-Rock finally turned away, walking down the corridor, the sound of his chains dragging against the floor with every step. Mark watched until he disappeared through the final set of doors. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel triumph. He just felt done. The air outside was cool, the sky a deep blue with the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. Mark stood at the top of the prison steps, taking in a slow breath, letting the weight of the night settle into his bones. It was over, for real this time. The first morning, after everything felt different. For the first time in weeks, Vanessa woke up without the familiar weight of dread pressing against her chest. The house was quiet, except for the faint rustling of the wind outside, the distant hum of a car rolling down the street. She sat up slowly, wrapping her arms around her knees, listening. She could hear Mark in the kitchen, the soft clang of a coffee mug against the counter, the quiet murmur of water running. It was such a simple sound, but it carried so much meaning. He was here. He was home. And after everything, that was what mattered. A slow smile spread across her lips. By the time she made her way downstairs, Mark was already setting out breakfast. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast. But it was warm and real, and right now, that was enough. He turned as she stepped in, his eyes immediately locking onto hers, scanning her like he always did, making sure she was okay. Morning, he said, voice low but steady. Vanessa leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, he admitted. Figured I'd make myself useful. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "You did more than enough," Mark exhaled, nodding slightly. But there was something in his eyes. Something unfinished. He set the spatula down and turned fully toward her. "I was thinking," he started, his tone measured, careful. "Maybe we take a trip. Just us. Somewhere quiet." Vanessa blinked, surprised. "A trip?" "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. Maybe the coast? Maybe somewhere warmer." "You always said you wanted to see the Carolinas in the spring." She tilted her head, studying him. "Mark, are you trying to take me on vacation?" His lips twitched in the faintest smile. "Yeah, I guess I am." For a moment, she didn't say anything. The idea of leaving, even for a little while, felt foreign. But as she looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had burned with vengeance days ago, that had seen war long before she met him, she realized why he was suggesting it. He needed this. They both did. A breath of laughter escaped her lips. "You, Mr. Williams, are full of surprises." Mark stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, his grip gentle but firm. "We've been fighting for too long, Vanessa. I don't want us to just survive. I want us to live." A lump formed in her throat. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his chest, letting the warmth of him soak into her bones. She knew her cancer wasn't going anywhere, that there were still battles ahead, the treatments, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. But in this moment, with Mark holding her, talking about a future that wasn't defined by fear, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She looked up at him, her fingers tightening around his shirt. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's go." Mark kissed her forehead, lingering there for a moment before pulling back, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "We leave tomorrow." Vanessa smiled, closing her eyes as she leaned into him again, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat calm the storm inside her. Whatever time they had left, however long the road ahead was, they would face it together. And for now, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.